Hello, Tony. Bonjour.
Yes.
Good, and you?
Great.
I'm Laura-Janice.
And I'm Michael.
And we are the Disneyland Paris ambassadors 2017-2018. And we're so happy to share this little moment with you today for some questions about Disneyland Paris and all the beginning till today, the 25th anniversary of this park. Okay. Tony, today we would like to show you some photos, some memories of Disneyland Paris. And first of all, we would like to know if you see these photos, what are your memories of the construction of Disneyland Paris?
Oh my gosh. There's so many stories about construction. I mean, coming here, the first day that I was out on the site, it was agriculture. And I think there were beans or legumes on the area, and they had cut a big square X. And we walked out to the X, and they said, that's the castle where this X is, you know. And the rest was, it was windy, I remember, and all the beans were, or the plants were like bending in the wind, and we were all cold. And you couldn't even imagine that someday there would be a castle in this beautiful area. So that was the first memory. I think as each thing came up, it was fascinating because there were a lot of different construction companies from all over Europe. So as soon as they'd get steel up that might be Big Thunder or the castle or the Haunted Mansion, they would put their flags. So we had Irish flags, and we had English flags, and Dutch flags, and German flags, Italian flags, and of course French flags. And I think there was kind of a spirit of everybody was proud of their country and trying to do the best to, you know, and so it was kind of a neat thing to see all this competition out there. And I think nearing the completion, I remember probably even more than I remember opening day, 6 months before we opened, on October 12th, 1991, they decided to open the park for one day, and they brought all the guests into Town Square, and they had a curtain across Main Street, so you could not see the castle. Now, the night before, we had worked all night taking down the scaffolding, and so for the first time ever, it was at night. We had never seen it either because it was at night with all the lights. So that day when the curtain pulled back on Main Street, and we all looked down there, and there was the castle for the very, very first time. It was so exciting, and they let the guests go in, and they could walk through. I think we had the carousel and maybe the train ride around the park. That was just about all that was ready. But it was still so exciting, and I think it was the kind of spirit we needed to go for the rest of the 6 months, because it was getting colder in October. And it was so cold that winter when we were painting, we were doing all the fine painting, they would have to build a plastic building and then heat it, and then they could spray the paint, because if they sprayed the paint outside, it would turn into snow. It would come out of the nozzle and then fall to the ground like snow. So we had to like create all these buildings just to paint during the cold of that winter. But I know we were all inspired because we had seen how beautiful the castle looked that October, and now there was a spirit to go forward.
So Tony, I'd like to show you this second picture. Of course, you recognize this beautiful castle.
Yes, it's Disneyland.
Right.
My home.
Your home in California.
Yeah.
Could you tell us more about differences and similarities between Disneyland Park in California and Disneyland Park in Paris?
Well, Disneyland is smaller, and it's the first, and Walt Disney, it's the only park that Walt Disney had involvement in. Everything else has been the people that worked with Walt Disney bringing that to life in other places around the world. So it's very special to me because I was a child at Disneyland, and Disneyland was where I saw all these things as a little child, the way that you'd be when you didn't understand how to make rides or design rides. They were just exciting, as the many, many people I've talked to over this last week. They were very exciting to me. So when we came to the opportunity of doing Disneyland Paris, all of us, there was 5 producers on each of the lands: Eddie Sato on Main Street, Jeff Burke in Frontierland, Chris Tietz in Adventureland, Tom Morris in Fantasyland, and Tim Delaney here in Discoveryland. All of us were the same age, pretty much, and we grew up with Disneyland in California. So a lot of what I call the Disneyland DNA is richly infused into Disneyland Paris. The castle there is smaller, But our castle has the same kind of charm, I think, that Disneyland. It's not big and stupendous. It's just elegant and beautiful. And so one of the things we were trying to look for, so what is different about Disneyland and Florida and Paris? I was trying to give everyone a simple way to remember it. And I think Disneyland in California is the most charming of all the Disneyland parks. Florida at Walt Disney World is the most spectacular of all the parks. And Disneyland Paris, and after spending a week here, I confirm this, is the most beautiful of all the parks we've ever done.
Another question is about the European culture that we have here, especially in Disneyland Paris. What are the major inspirations and influence about the European culture in the park?
You know, there was a lot of effort that went into thinking about what belonged here and what didn't belong here when we began. And to guide us, we thought of three things. First, it's a new culture for us. We had done American parks and we had done a park in Japan, but we hadn't gone back to Europe because Europe is sort of where all of the stories of Walt Disney began. So we weren't bringing something, you know, that was foreign to like Japan. We were bringing back things that began here in the original form. So the Brothers Grimm, the, you know, Perrault, these writers created Cinderella and stories like Snow White. And so we knew we were bringing something into this culture that was already their culture. So what should we enhance and what other things would go away? Three of the things that we had to deal with was not just the cultural aspects, which meant language was going to be a little bit more significant for us since there are 5 European languages that we know are visitors to this park. So if there's a choice between having a sign and having architecture or an attraction that you can tell what it is by just looking at it. So the Haunted Mansion became Phantom Manor, and it looks haunted, whereas in Disneyland it doesn't look haunted. You have to read the sign. Pirates of the Caribbean, we've got a pirate ship, we've got a skull, we've got all of these things that say pirates visually. In California, it's just in a building that looks like a city building, and you go under the sign that says Pirates of the Caribbean. So there was the cultural aspect driven by the languages, but also then the climate here is very different. So we knew half the year would not be sunny. And so we had to create different ways of moving through the park. And in the front, we built the beautiful Disneyland Hotel for 2 reasons. At first, it wasn't going to be a real hotel. It was just going to be a symbol that you went through while you bought your tickets and so forth. And we thought it's a symbol of hospitality. An inn is gracious, it's welcoming, and so we'll have just an artificial hotel. And Michael looked at the picture, Michael Eisner, and said, that's a beautiful idea, why don't we make it a real hotel? And everyone was rather shocked because we'd never considered having a hotel right at the doorway to a Disneyland park. And so many people thought it wouldn't work. They said all kinds of crazy things. But of course, it's turned out to be our most popular, the most beautiful. And all the other parks have tried to copy it. So if you go to Tokyo now, you'll find a Disneyland Hotel right out in front. And they also have the Miracosta in front of the Disney Sea. And Disneyland in California has the Grand Californian right out in front of that park. So it's a very successful model, but it began right here, and it was something that we did because culturally, we felt there's a need for a sense of arrival. Now, in the other parks, you might just come out of the parking area and there's tickets. You buy your tickets and then you go in and it's beautiful. But here we thought it needs to be beautiful before you buy your tickets because that's part of the European culture. So there were a lot of things like that. Walking down Main Street, in Tokyo, they covered it with glass so that you can shop. But when we studied people in Paris, they all go into the sidewalk cafes and they stay outdoors. Unless it's pouring rain, they're outdoors. So we thought if we cover Main Street, it'll take all that outdoor vitality out of it. So we left Main Street open, but we built arcades, which are very European, behind the street. We don't see those in America, but they're very typical. You can go to Italy all the way up to London and find beautiful arcades. So those are on the back side of the street. And that gives us the protection for the weather. But when it's nice, everybody's out on Main Street, and I'm very glad we did that. I think there was a fascination about the West that everybody in Europe is wondering if they'll ever have the wherewithal to get to America and see where John Wayne and John Ford and all these beautiful rock formations and everything. It's so different from what Europe looks like that we felt, and then it turned out to be true, that that would be very successful here because we're only 40 minutes from the Eiffel Tower. And when you walk into Frontierland, it's like stepping into a page of the American West, and it's so iconic. It's something I think people over here would, dream of seeing sometime in their life. And we can bring it to them very quickly and easily right here in Disneyland Paris. So Frontierland, I think, was successful, and we knew it was going to be a big hit when we designed it. And not all the areas were that way. I mean, with Tomorrowland at Disneyland, we thought, do we bring that over there? And it doesn't say much about Europe. It really talks about American industry. And so we thought, how could we frame that up, and what is unique about Europe? So Tomorrowland became Discoveryland. And the reason why is we found that most of the dreamers of the world have been inspired by great minds from Europe. So whether it was Jules Verne here in France, or it was H.G. Wells in England, or it was Leonardo da Vinci in Italy, whatever, these are minds, and their writings and their stories have inspired generations of people to do things that are fantastic. So we came up with the idea of dreams fuel the future. So if Jules Verne dreamed of going to the moon and said, I believe it will launch from Florida in the United States, maybe some little kid read that book and said, that's a good idea. Maybe we'll launch the first rocket from, near Orlando in Florida. So who knows how many people have been inspired by the dreamers, and many of the dreamers that we honor here are from Europe. People ask me, how do you accommodate like Star Wars and George Lucas into that? And my theory is that Jules Verne was the George Lucas of his time. And for kids growing up today, they hear, read, see George Lucas's stories, Star Wars, Indiana Jones. And those are the stories that will inspire them to do something with their lives. So dreams are still building the future. And Discoveryland should be a place where we can keep adding new dreamers that come along and celebrate their dreams by letting kids be a part of that. Fantasyland, that's classic Europe. So we were very lucky that Walt Disney had made many motion pictures that were stories come to life in film that began as European fairy tales. So Blanche-Neige and Cendrillon. I'm terrible with my French, sorry about that. So to me, Snow White and Cinderella, the Brothers Grimm and Perrault, these are tales that lived many, many hundreds, almost hundreds of years before they became Disney animated films. And so it was a pleasure to bring that back and give each one of them a little bit of flavor of a fairy tale village from Germany, or a fairy tale village from France, or a fairy tale from Italy. So it was a pleasure, and we knew that would be fun. And finally, Adventureland, we had the biggest and most favorite ride in Disneyland to place there, which was Pirates of the Caribbean. And we focused the land around pirates, and we put together an island with lots of stories about pirates, from the Swiss Family Robinson and Treasure Island, and Pirates of the Caribbean is now a movie franchise. So we have this perfect land where kids can play like pirates and run around in the caves and get lost. And now that we have the films, it's a wonderful place to build even more stories around because of the new pirate movies, including one that comes up this summer. So we're excited about that. And at the front of Adventureland, we found that over here in Europe, because in America, the European fairy tales are exotic the same way Frontierland is exotic to Europeans. Well, for us to come to a French village and see the romantic village houses and so forth, that's a dream for an American. Then we found that a lot of Europeans have a favor for the Arabian Nights stories and the exotic Middle East and Sinbad and the 1001 Nights and Babar the Elephant. There was a real following for that because it was far away. reading a story about Cinderella. She lives down the block, you know, in a village here. So we emphasized that at the front of Adventureland, which gave us the only park, the only Disney park that has that Aladdin-like flavor. It also helped that Disney was producing the movie Aladdin right while we were building Disneyland Paris, so we kind of knew that would be a new classic for us. So we put a little emphasis on that in the front. So those are the kind of things that I think drove us culturally. In addition to that, going into the rides like Space Mountain and Pirates of the Caribbean, we tried to add more technology in there. So we had fighting pirates. We had a Space Mountain that fired you out of a cannon and had onboard audio. So a lot of those things are part of what we have to do anywhere we go in the world. Time marches on and you have new tools and new technologies, and we have to constantly be aware of them and figure out ways to put them into the park. So it's still as amazing for very sophisticated audiences today as it was for a simpler time when Walt Disney originated Disneyland.
So this is a photo of Sabine Macon, our first ambassador of Disneyland Paris in 1992.
How is she doing?
Actually, Michael and me, we just met her in February. She came for a week with her girl and spent some time here in the Disneyland Park, and she's doing very great.
Well, if she comes back for the 25th, tell her Tony gives her his best. Yeah, that'd be nice. Yeah.
So this is a picture of Sabine, but there is also these pictures with all the cast members at the grand opening ceremony.
Well,
in 1992.
Yeah. Well, you know, the ambassador program was started by Walt Disney back at Disneyland, and he realized they were just starting to think about building Florida. And up until that time, Walt Disney was on television. Walt Disney did all the interviews like this. It was always Walt Disney. And I think he began to realize we're going to get bigger, and we have to have a way of having someone be the voice and the image for our parks. And so the ambassador program was started so that Walt Disney could spend his time making movies and doing all of that, and there would be somebody who was the spokesperson for the parks. And so the first ambassadors, they worked directly with Walt Disney. There's several movies that were done for television where you can see Walt showing the ambassadors the new rides like Pirates and the Haunted Mansion. But then Walt Disney passed away, and the ambassador program is spread to each of our parks. Every 2 years they have a new ambassador pair now, I guess both of you, that go out and represent each of the parks around the world. But it's more than that. I think it's, you know, representative of the whole idea of being cast members. And at Disneyland we have all these lands which are made to make the guests believe that there are people that live in these worlds, because otherwise they're just sets. So when I say to people, I do a program called Who Lives at Disneyland, and we create all the types of people, and a lot of these images you see in films, the cowboys, the Indians, the Native Americans, all of the characters, the saloon characters, and the bad guys and the good guys, and that's the kind of flavor that lives, say, in Frontierland. And each of the lands has a cast of people. And I would love to find a way that we can make sure when you put on your costume each day and you go out into the park, you know what your role is. You know the role you're playing, and it's part of a story. And so when people see the backdrop and they see they're in Adventureland in a jungle on a tropical island with treasure, then your role needs to be one of somebody that would be there on that island and helping to tell that story and putting a focus on it. So while we have the ambassador up at the top of all this, we have many, many cast members throughout the whole land that are telling stories about, if you're working in the Auberge de Cendrillon, you're telling the story of Cinderella as you walk through there. You're someone that would have lived in that time and in that part of a fairy tale. If you're in Discoveryland, you're part of the group that's creating dreams for tomorrow, the future. So the costumes change, the way you act changes. And so you might have a job today in Discoveryland, and then tomorrow you're over in Frontierland. And it's not that you're the same human being, you are, but you're a different actor in those roles. You're talking about technology and the future and being a part of a brave new world. Over there, you're howdy partners, we're back in the past. So, you know, it's really important that the cast understand that. You know, if we didn't use the term cast, we'd use the word employee. And if we didn't use the word costume, we'd use the word uniform. So if you're an employee in a uniform, that's where everyone else works. But here at Disneyland, you're part of the cast. You're telling a story, and you wear a costume that helps tell that story. And so the more we can get our cast members to understand the role they're playing and can give that to the guests that they interact with, the better time our guests will have and the more they like coming back here again and again. It's very important that they come back and they want to come back. So all that we can do to take the time we have with the guests and the interactions and make it a story rather than an employee, handling a customer. Those are the normal English words, employee and customer. And here it's a cast member and a guest. And the guest is in the audience coming to see our show. That's what it's about.
So thank you very much, Tony, for sharing this moment with us. It was a real pleasure and honor to have you here in Paris for this 25th anniversary.
And I hope to be back. Bring me back for the 30th anniversary. All right, okay.